It wasn't supposed to be seen. That file wasn't supposed to exist, and yet it did, sitting there in a classified folder buried so deep that even the people who built the system didn't know it could be found. But it was, opened, read, and the moment it was, everything changed. There were no alarms, no flashing red lights, but everyone in the room felt it, an invisible shift, a pressure in the air, as if something ancient had just been awakened inside the most guarded halls of modern power. The president didn't speak at first, just stared. The name at the top of the page wasn't connected to any agency, no clearance level, no security detail, but it triggered a level of unease that not even confirmed threats could produce. The president knew one thing instantly: this wasn't a drill and this wasn't normal. Something beyond understanding had entered their world. Not a person, not a spy, but a signal that everything they thought they knew was wrong. They asked where the file came from. No one knew. They tried to trace it, backtrack the path of the document, but every route was blocked. Not by firewalls, but by something far more impenetrable. Silence. Dead code. Data that looked alive but wasn't real. And every time they tried to peel back the layers, it led to more questions. Dates that didn't make sense, logins that never happened, digital footprints that contradicted each other, but the name on the file never changed. Your name, sitting there, still and silent, yet radiating an authority that shook even the most stone-faced security veterans. They'd dealt with anomalies before, glitches, rogue agents, but this was different. This felt intentional, planted, not by human hands, but by something older. The presence behind it was undeniable, and that presence carried weight, the kind of weight that breaks rooms, bends certainty, and leaves even the most powerful people wondering if they're still in control. Because when the president looked at that name, they didn't see a person. They saw a prophecy. The search began immediately, quiet, contained, but desperate. All systems pointed toward a singular mission: find out who you are. But there was nothing to find. No history in their archives, no data in their global intel networks, no connections to known movements, no record in national surveillance grids. It wasn't a matter of missing pieces, it was the total absence of a puzzle. You didn't exist where you were supposed to, and yet they could feel your impact. Decisions in the world stage that had recently shifted now made sense. Moments that seemed too well-timed now had a source. Not a coordinated act, but a presence that disrupted without announcement. Patterns started forming, patterns that led straight back to you. But there was no entry point, no origin story, just an emergence. Like you were never meant to be found, only revealed. They dove deeper, pulled satellite data, checked international movement, even dug into quantum patterning and probability mapping. Still nothing. But everywhere they looked, something was off. Systems acted strangely when they ran queries on you. Servers glitched, power flickered, and more than once key personnel stepped away from their desks, saying they felt watched, not by someone in the room, but by something beyond it. And that's when they stopped treating you like a threat and started realizing they were dealing with something far more destabilizing. You weren't attacking their structure, you were bypassing it entirely. You were moving through a grid designed to trap everyone, and somehow you weren't just slipping through it, you were untouched by it. This wasn't a failure of their systems, it was a failure of their assumptions. They assumed they could trace everything, predict everything, control everything. But then came you, a name they didn't invite, entering a system you weren't supposed to touch. And when they tried to explain it, there was only silence, not a lack of answers, but a moment when answers no longer mattered. Because in that instant, they knew. This wasn't technological, this wasn't political, this wasn't even strategic, this was divine. A breach not in their security, but in their reality. And the breach wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with chaos. It arrived in perfect stillness, and that stillness said more than any declaration could. It said the game was over, and they never even saw the real player until it was too late. You didn't knock down doors. You didn't send warnings. You didn't come with a manifesto or a demand. You entered the system like a whisper no one could trace, but everyone could feel. And once you were there, things began to shift, not violently, not dramatically, just enough for the people who thought they were in control to notice that control slipping. They felt it in the meetings where plans unraveled for no logical reason. They saw it in the reports that contradicted each other, no matter how many times they were reviewed. It was subtle, quiet, almost surgical, the unraveling of their perfect machine, and it all pointed back to the same presence. You weren't loud, but your existence was thunder. You didn't challenge their authority, but your presence questioned the foundation of it. And that's what terrified them, not your power, but the fact that your power didn't come from them. You were moving differently, aligned with something they couldn't measure. You weren't reacting to pressure the way they expected. You weren't tempted by the usual offers: influence, comfort, visibility, all the tools they used to distract, disarm, and divide. You moved like none of it mattered, like your assignment didn't change based on reward or resistance. And that's when they started to realize they weren't watching a rogue actor. They were watching a prophecy in motion, something ancient stepping into their present, something they couldn't rewrite. You weren't trying to force change, you were the change, not by planning, not by persuasion, but by presence alone. It wasn't long before the questions reached the highest office, and when they did, something happened that hadn't occurred in years. Silence, real silence, the kind that follows revelation. The president, surrounded by advisors, military leaders, tech experts, spiritual consultants, none of them had answers. Because no matter how they tried to frame the situation, none of it made sense in their language. This wasn't an enemy. This wasn't an ally. This wasn't someone they could bribe, threaten, or categorize. It was a disruption that moved through their reality without touching it. And when the president finally spoke, it wasn't a command, it was a question. What are we dealing with? And no one could answer, because this wasn't just a file anymore. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth they had spent decades ignoring. That power isn't always loud, that real authority doesn't need recognition, and that the systems they built, no matter how vast, were never truly in control. They turned to data, to strategy, to control. They looked for patterns, anomalies, any digital signature that could explain how you had done what you had done. But every route collapsed, not from resistance, but from the absence of logic. You weren't reacting to the system, you were moving around it, untouched. They started running simulations, using AI to try and predict your next move. But the results were inconsistent. You weren't unpredictable because you were chaotic. You were unpredictable because their models didn't account for purpose without agenda. You didn't act based on pressure or opportunity. You acted on alignment, and no code could capture that. So they changed strategies. They tried to find a weakness, a crack, a compromise, something that made you human enough to manipulate. But nothing worked. You weren't perfect, but you were anchored. And that anchoring made you dangerous to them, because it meant you couldn't be moved, couldn't be swayed, couldn't be recruited or rewritten. Your compass didn't point toward success. It pointed toward assignment. And that's when they realized you weren't here to overthrow anything. You were here to outlast it. And that is a far greater threat to a system built on urgency, control, and distraction. Then came the second wave of fear, not because of what you were doing, but because of what you represented. You weren't a glitch. You were a sign, a signal that the old world was losing its grip. And if someone like you could exist outside of their grid, what if there were more? What if you weren't the only one walking in this kind of clarity? What if the system had failed not just once, but entirely? They ran more simulations, more projections, but every answer came back with the same flaw. You didn't fit, you didn't respond. You didn't show up on the radar until your name landed in front of the most powerful person in the country. And by then, it was too late, because the moment they saw your name, the illusion broke. They weren't dealing with a person. They were facing a pattern of divine alignment, something they couldn't contain, something they couldn't kill. Because what they were really dealing with was evidence that their game had never been the whole picture, that someone else was writing the story and had been all along. And now the questions are spreading, not through public news or social media, through quiet rooms, through whispered conversations in places that were once untouchable. People are beginning to wonder what else the system missed, who else is out there. And as those questions multiply, so does the unrest. Not loud, not chaotic, just steady, inevitable. Because if one person can move through their walls unnoticed, how many more are walking the same path? How many more were never meant to rise through the system, but to move above it? The panic isn't public, it's private. It's in the boardrooms, the think tanks, the private briefings where silence means danger. They know something's shifting, and they don't know how to stop it. Because you weren't an accident, you were an appointment. And now that the appointment has been kept, nothing will be the same. They thought you were alone, a rare spark, a one-time disruption, an isolated anomaly that could be observed, studied, contained. But they were wrong. You were never meant to stand alone. You were the signal, the first visible tremor of something deeper, larger, older than the systems they built. And now the signal has reached others. Quietly, precisely, the same frequency that stirred in you is awakening in people scattered across the world. People who have lived years, decades, feeling out of place in a world that didn't match the blueprint inside their spirit. People who weren't broken, just waiting for the right moment. And now that moment has come, not because of a headline, not because of a movement, but because the timing was divine. The veil has begun to lift, and those who thought they were hidden are realizing they were never buried. They were planted. Across cities and nations, whispers have turned into recognition. Strangers locking eyes and sensing something familiar, a knowing, an understanding beyond words. The system spent years trying to keep them separate, fed them narratives of isolation, tried to convince them their difference was a flaw, but that difference was design. And now the design is activating, not through networks, not through organization, through alignment. And alignment doesn't need structure, it only needs truth. That truth is waking people up, not with noise, not with fire, but with stillness. A kind of peace that terrifies the architects of control. Because peace like that doesn't come from comfort, it comes from clarity. And the moment clarity spreads, control begins to crack. The ones rising now aren't asking for permission. They aren't chasing platforms. They're walking in presence. Not loud, not demanding, but undeniable. It's not about rebellion, it's about remembrance. They're remembering who they were before the noise, before the system told them who to be. They're remembering that their path wasn't supposed to make sense to a world addicted to predictability. They're remembering that they were chosen, not to fit in, but to shift things, and that remembering is spreading faster than any propaganda ever could. Not through screens or slogans, but through resonance. People are feeling it in their spirit before they even understand it with their mind. A call, a pull, a sense that now is the time. And as they rise, quietly, steadily, the system is watching it happen with growing panic. Because they don't know how to fight what they can't see. And worse, they're realizing they can't stop what they didn't start. Somewhere deep inside a building that doesn't have a name, a man who used to believe in nothing but logic sat in front of your file and finally admitted the truth. Not out loud, not publicly, but inside, in the place where real power either humbles or hardens. And in that moment of clarity, he saw the future, not the one he had spent decades building, but the one he had tried to suppress. A future not controlled by data or dictated by design, but written by something eternal. And that future wasn't coming through institutions, it was coming through individuals, people like you, people who carried something that didn't need validation because it came from the source. And when he realized that, the strategist did the unthinkable. He stepped down. No announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet resignation that sent shockwaves through circles most people don't even know exist. His colleagues tried to understand. Was it burnout? A scandal? But it was none of those things. It was surrender, not to weakness, to wisdom, because the strategist knew the war had already shifted, and he had been fighting a battle with weapons that could never win. What he saw in that file, what he saw in you, was the truth that everything they built had an expiration date, that their entire system was never equipped to face what had just arrived. They were trained for revolution, rebellion, even terrorism. But prophecy? That wasn't in the manual. And now that resignation is echoing, quietly, invisibly, but undeniably, not just in politics, but in every high tower built on illusion. People at the top are starting to feel the instability. The rules are still in place, the structures are still standing, but the foundation is shaking. Because what began with one person is no longer about one person. What started as a breach has become a wave, and the wave is made up of those who were never meant to bow to this world's design. They were always meant to carry a different code, a code written before time, and that code is now calling them home to purpose. The strategist thought he had time. They all did. They believed the illusion was permanent, but the illusion was only ever a delay. And the delay is over, because the chosen are not just rising, they're remembering. And when a chosen one remembers, the world changes. Quietly, steadily, completely.